The crest jewel of wisdom is, along with the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, one of the ancient sacred texts that has guided many along their spiritual path for centuries. The crest jewel of wisdom is the English translation of the Sanskrit words Viveka Chudamani. The date and the authorship of this book are unknown, but it is generally accepted to be the work of Sri Adi Shankaracharya. Who was he? Well, esoteric Buddhism believes that about 50 years after his death, the Gautama Buddha, having refused full Dharmakaya and Nirvana, and for the purposes of karma and philanthropy, was reborn as Shankaracharya, the greatest Vedantic teacher in India. And the esoteric Buddhism states Shankaracharya simply was Buddha in all respects in a new body. H.P. Blavatsky says in her book, The Mystery of Buddha, and I quote, "While the expression in its mystic sense is true, the way of putting it may be misleading until explained. Shankaracharya was a Buddha, most assuredly, but he never was a reincarnation of the Buddha, although Gautama's astral ego, or rather his bodhisattva, may have been associated in some mysterious way with Shankaracharya. Yes," she says, "it was perhaps the ego, Gautama, under a new and better adapted casket, that of a Brahmin of southern India." The end of the quote. However, on grounds of style and terminology, it is thought today to have been composed by some outstanding Advaitic author who lived some centuries after the great Shankaracharya of the commentaries, possibly in the late 10th century. Now, the word Viveka comes from the Sanskrit word vik, meaning to sift, and is usually translated as spiritual discrimination. And the word Chudamani means crest jewel. So where is and what do we mean by the crest jewel? Now, according to Raghavan Iyer, it is the crest above the forehead of the human body. He calls it the regal gem of pure discernment and spiritual wakefulness. Now, in this talk, we will be examining the meanings of several important words and phrases. And we begin with the word discernment. The word discernment, according to the dictionary, means good judgment and insight. The Viveka Chudamani is set out, as are many Eastern sacred texts, as a dialogue between a guru and a disciple. And the purpose of the writings is to set out for the disciple instructions on how to achieve enlightenment. The topics covered include how to overcome the obstacles that will inevitably be encountered along the way, how to discriminate between the unreal and the real, instructions on meditation and Vedantic philosophy, such as the gunas. Now, the gunas, tamas, rajas, and sattva, and these are the three constituents of nature, the panchakoshas, the 5 sheaves of existence, and the 3 states of consciousness, the waking, the dreaming, and the dreamless state. Now, Shankara gets us thinking right from the start, as in the second verse, he stresses the difficulty of obtaining self-realization. And I quote, "It is hard for living creatures to attain human birth. Harder still to become a man. Harder still to become a Brahmin. Harder still to be devoted to the spiritual path of the Vedas. Harder still to acquire learning in that domain. But to effect a complete discrimination of the self from the not self, and to have direct experience of one's true nature and liberation in the form of establishment in the self as the absolute, that is not attained without the good deeds of many millions of lives. That's the end of quote. So, self-realization possibly takes millions of lifetimes and is a hard path for the aspirant to tread. How can it be achieved? We are told that it is by learning to distinguish between self and not self, and by gaining the wisdom of discrimination. How do we recognize the difference between the self and the not self? In the Bhagavad Gita, the second verse of the 13th chapter, we read the following. Know that I am the knower in all the fields of my creation, and that the wisdom which sees the field and the knower of the field is true wisdom. It is the mind. In the technical language of Indian philosophy, the human body is called the field because the fruits of actions, karma, are reaped therein. The knower of the field, in other words, man's spirit, is separate from it. This verse means then that God is all-knowing, and the knowledge of the field and the knower of the field, of the man and his real self, is the true knowledge of metaphysics. For liberation and for the freedom from suffering and bondage, man needs to be able to identify the individual self with the cosmic self. And when this state of liberation has been achieved in one's life on earth, it is called Jivan Mukti. How can we achieve liberation? Shankara tells us it is by prayer, devotion, compassion, performing good deeds, and by leading others along the right path. However, he says, these attributes alone are not enough, for it is also necessary to have the guidance of a teacher who has achieved enlightenment. The first step along the road to enlightenment is to ask oneself certain questions, such as, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of life on earth? What am I doing with my life? When we have a satisfactory answer to these questions and other similar ones, we will experience compassion, wisdom, happiness, and freedom. What do we mean by freedom? It means being masters of our minds, masters of immortality, having overcome death through the practices of charity, duty, and prayer, and by knowing the truth of the real. How do we obtain knowledge of the truth? Shankara tells us that it is by overcoming desires for the pleasures of the senses and by becoming indifferent to any gain or reward resulting from our actions. He says it is not only by performing many deeds, however meritorious they may be, but by introspective reflection that we reach the truth. It is the mind which plays such a significant part in the search for truth, because the mind can be both an aid as well as a hindrance to us. Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutra, talks about the fluctuation of the mind and the importance of calming the mind by yoga practices. Now, we can think of the mind like an ocean, which is always in motion on the surface, sometimes angry and violent, as in a storm, and sometimes calmer when just a gentle breeze causes ripples to disturb its surface. Yet beneath the surface, the ocean is still, and it is in the depths of the ocean that the mind discovers profound wisdom. How can we calm the mind to reach the depths of wisdom? Shankara tells us it is by the practices of desirelessness, devotion, and compassion, and by meditating on one's true self. It requires self-study and a deep conviction in the oneness of all life, and that the spiritual truth will never change. In verse 13, he warns that knowledge of reality does not come only through rituals, such as bathing in sacred places or being charitable, nor by practicing breathing techniques, but by meditation and with the guidance of a teacher who has the knowledge one seeks. Now I'm going to talk about the attributes which are necessary for the knowledge of the truth. And the first one is discrimination, or viveka. In the spiritual sense, this means being able to discriminate between the unreal and the real. These days, the word discrimination can and does have political and unpleasant overtones. The dictionary has 4 definitions of the word discrimination. The first, and presumably the most commonly used, is unfavorable treatment based on prejudices, especially regarding race, age, or sex. I feel that, sadly, this is how many people think of the word today. However, the word does have positive definitions as well as the negative ones. The second definition is good taste or judgment in artistic matters. And the third is the power of discriminating or observing differences. And the fourth definition is a distinction made with the mind or in action. We can discriminate on several levels, by our actions, by our thoughts, and with our emotions. We can be overcritical, unnecessarily judgmental, and we can be prejudiced in many aspects of our lives. Now, this is not the discrimination we are talking about. We must forget all negative meanings of the word and concentrate on the positive aspects. We are talking about being able to distinguish between what in this life is everlasting and what is not. We will eventually come to realize that everything in this world has a beginning and an ending, and is therefore considered finite. Anything that dies cannot be thought of as real and having permanence. Only that which never dies can be real. Discrimination means we should always be vigilant, so we get to know what is passing and what is eternal, and then to ignore the former and cling to the latter with all the strength of the soul. The second attribute required for the knowledge of truth is detachment. The Sanskrit word for this is vairagya, and it means becoming detached from the enjoyment of all rewards in this life and in those lives to come. It means allowing ourselves to be unaffected by and indifferent to the pleasures of life. We need our five senses to be able to acknowledge our existence, for without them in our lives, we could not function. I'm not saying that we cannot get enjoyment in our life, but living only for the desires of life's pleasures brings us neither happiness nor spiritual contentment. Our aim in life should be to know the reality of the oneness of all things, and by letting go of all material desires and attachments. And I'm going to quote verse 375. It says this: O wise one, know that detachment and metaphysical understanding are the two wings of the soul, whereby it soars upwards like a bird. It cannot alight on the pinnacle of liberation by the use of only one wing without the other. Detachment means that you have the power to extricate yourself from any object, any experience in the world, however sweet it may be, at a moment's notice. The reward for detachment is knowledge of the true self and the peace and bliss that this brings. So the next attribute required is devotion. Shankara defines devotion as the investigation of one's true nature, or as some prefer to put it, the investigation of the true nature of the self. How do we investigate our true nature, our self, you may ask? And the answer is by devoting ourselves to spiritual practices, such as meditation, by compassion, and by following a guru or someone who has found their own self and is prepared to guide others along the path to enlightenment. Devotion to a spiritual ideal dispels the darkness and gloom of narrow self-love. It is the way out of the web of karma into the light of pure consciousness and freedom from bondage. Also acquired for the knowledge of truth are inner control. And this means constantly fixing one's mind on the goal by keeping calm and creating a tranquil mind in all circumstances. Outer control, and this is described as using ourselves humbly as servants of others, and by using our talents positively for the good of humanity. Also required is withdrawal of the mind from external objects and concentrating on peace and bliss. And then there's endurance. And this is described as the ability to create indifference to the pairs of opposites, such as pain and pleasure, and doing so without complaining or becoming anxious. This requires forbearance and tolerance. All these should be accompanied by a faith in the teachings of the sacred scriptures and by continually fixing one's mind on the absolute. Now here's a question. What is the mind? The mind can be thought of as the connection between the body and the soul. The mind has a dual nature. It can be our friend and play its part in the liberation of the soul, but it can also act as our enemy and maintain attachment to the physical body. How do we release ourselves from bondage? How do we find the truth? And the first thing we need to do is to discard all likes and dislikes. Next is to pursue detachment and discrimination with heart and soul. Shankara talks about having a pure mind, which is sattvic in nature, while an impure mind is governed by tamas and rajas. When the light of the soul shines through a pure and unsullied mind, it is untainted and radiant. However, an impure mind dulls the soul's light and prevents it from shining. How do we purify the mind? The first thing to do is to allow the mind to become still and tranquil. We need to be resolute and courageous, and to harbour only spiritual desires. We need to continually practice discrimination and detachment. We are reminded that the chief medium through which the divine life expresses itself is the mind, and that as the mind is, so is life. If the mind is impure, thoughts are impure and actions confused. An impure mind is full of desires, and the chief function of the mind is to fulfill those desires. Even some good desires may produce disharmony. All desires are impediments to freedom. And another quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, verse 37 of the 3rd chapter, says, Krishna, speaking to Arjuna, says this: greedy desire and wrath born of passion are the great evils, the sum of destruction and the great enemy of the soul. The spiritual life begins with subduing harmful lower desires prompted by either passion, rajas, or lethargy, tamas, and by promoting goodness and higher sattvic desires. Sattva, tamas, and rajas are the three constituents of nature. Everything in life, from the smallest to the biggest, from the humblest to the grandest, contains these three in varying degrees. The human being is included in this. So, tamas is often described as inertia or laziness. Rajas is like the opposite of tamas, being considered as activity or passion, whereas sattva is the in-between state of reflection and tranquility. The sattvic state should predominate our lives, as this leads to a quietening of our minds. We should discard thoughts that inhibit our powers of discrimination and detachment. The things we should try to avoid are disharmony, anger, impatience, superiority, and desire for worldly pleasures. The things we should acquire and nurture are loving kindness, humility, contentment, selflessness, and a desire for the truth. There must be yearning for freedom, which will conquer the love of the senses. We must also have faith in the sacred scriptures, and we must put into practice their teachings. Reading about and listening to sacred texts is only the start of spiritual inquiry. Then we must put all our spiritual ideals into practice. We must realize that our bodies are only a temporary vehicle for our souls. So learning to be detached from them is the beginning of the path to liberation and freedom from the wheel of death, rebirth. The danger of being obsessed with our physical image, our power or prestige or possessions is such that such obsessions hide our true nature. So it is by not becoming a slave to our body or to our senses and emotions that is the start of our journey to freedom. Sadly, today's Western culture pays much attention to fashion and fame. I feel that the craze of taking selfies all the time, anywhere and everywhere, only enhances our self-image. I think we are in danger of becoming a vain, proud, boastful, and self-loving society. I'm not saying that we should not care for and nurture our bodies, because it's important that we do all we can to keep fit and healthy. All we need to do is to realize that our inner life that is more important, as it is the part of us that does not perish. The next question, what is truth? This is a big question when one thinks about it. I would like to refer you to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra again, and particularly to the first part of his Eightfold Path. The first limb, as it is called, consists of the 5 yamas, or self-restraints, one of which is satya, non-lying. The other 4 are non-violence, non-stealing, non-sensuality, and non-acquisitiveness, perhaps better expressed as harmlessness, truthfulness, honesty, temperance, and freedom from greed. And it is said that if one of these yamas is practiced earnestly, then the rest will follow naturally. And it doesn't matter which one you choose. How many phrases in the English language contain the word true or truth? I think there are many, but I've just thought of 2 here. First one, being true to yourself, or being true to oneself. And the other one is telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Not doing this in a court of law is an act of perjury and could lead to a prison sentence. And then, of course, there is Krishnamurti's famous phrase, truth is a pathless land. However, the mind can play tricks on us and will let us think something is true when it's not. We can be so programmed that we preempt events and see what we want to see and not what really happened. So we must not trust our minds to lead us to truth. But if that is the case, how will we ever know the truth? Surely it's by reasoning and logic that we make sense of the world around us. Of course it is. But to know the real truth, we need to go deeper into the mind by practicing stillness and meditation. Do we always tell the truth? I would say that we would consider ourselves to be truthful people and not intentionally speak otherwise. However, we must be ever watchful that we do not unintentionally pass on gossip and spread rumours. We must also be careful not to be judgmental and overcritical in our dealings with others. The motto of our society, as I'm sure you know, there is no religion higher than truth. More correctly, it should read, there is no dharma higher than truth. Now, the word dharma is quite difficult to translate into English. There's no one word. Duty is one word that is often used, and another one righteous action. So let us make our lives truthful, be honest, straightforward, and open, and do not pretend to be other than who we really are. Be true to yourself. I see the life of a theosophist as one of service to others in whatever way is appropriate. We all have different things to give and different ways of doing this, but none of us should think theirself to be superior or better than anyone else. If prestige or power should come to us, then we should adopt a demeanor of indifference to these things and carry on doing our duty, our dharma, to others. Being generous with our time and energy will bring its own rewards. All this is being true to ourselves. Knowing who we really are, we do not pretend to be anything but a servant of our higher self. We are a spiritual entity, temporarily in a physical body, that needs to be cared for but not worshipped. Being true to oneself means acknowledging the existence of the true self, that divine essence, that spark of divinity contained within us all. The purpose of a body and life on earth is to enable the soul to progress towards perfection. So, talking about perfection, what stops us gaining perfection, do you think? The inability to discriminate between the unreal and the real. Something we call Maya gets in the way of our endeavors to reach perfection in this life.
Illusion.
Eastern philosophy states that the absolute alone exists, and there is no variation or plurality, no sin or vice in him. However, there is a principle which is responsible for the phenomenal limitations and conditions, and that principle is called Maya. The whole world is the product of Maya. Another word for it is illusion. And this is often a difficult concept to grasp by our limited minds. Shankara says that Maya consists of the three gunas, the constituents of nature, or states of being, which I've already mentioned: sattva, equilibrium; rajas, motion; tamas, rest. It is said that Maya cannot be perceived, only inferred by humility and true inquiry. Time and space are factors of Maya, as is the law of cause and effect. Maya can only be dissolved by the knowledge of the absolute, of truth. Next question is, what is the nature of the self? The self is the true being, which is eternal and whose nature is bliss. Bliss is to self as heat is to fire and cold is to ice. Only someone who has been freed from the bondage of the not self can know the bliss of the Lord, which we know as Atman. The Atman is not born, nor does it die. It does not grow or shrink or change in any way. It is pure consciousness. It is immortal and cannot be modified. It is the essence of infinite bliss. How can we discover our true nature? It really all comes down to the control of the mind in three ways. First way is by avoiding anything vulgar which goes against the laws of truth and divine love. And the second is by regulating our desires and by sattvic practices. And the third is by purifying our intellect and aspiring to divinity. We must learn to discriminate between self and the not self if we want to end the continual cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. We must strive to expand our consciousness to the level of our highest self while still in this mundane world. Only then a person can know his or her own true nature as existence, consciousness, and bliss, and Sanskrit, Sat, Chit, Ananda. Shankara expounds on the Vedantic philosophy of the five sheaths, or in Sanskrit, Pancha Koshas. And the first is the Annamaya Kosha, or the food sheath. It exists only by the food we eat. It is unstable, ever-changing, and will, as we know, eventually die. Therefore, it cannot be thought of as one's true self, the supreme reality. So we must abstain from identifying ourselves with the food sheath. And the next sheath is the Pranamaya Kosha, or the vital energy sheath. It enables the physical body to move and act. And this is also not the true self, as it is in constant motion, rather like the oceans and the winds. The third sheath is called the Manomaya Kosha, and this is our thinking principle, which contains the five organs of perception. It is responsible for the production of our joys and sorrows. It is the creator of the dream world and can both create and destroy obstructions on the way to self-realization. Manomaya Kosha can also be thought of as the lower mind, but it is not the real self. The next sheath is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, or the sheath of the higher mind. It consists of the higher mind itself with its modifications, along with this sense of organs and their modifications. It is also called the knowledge sheath, the intellect or buddhi. It is through desires and actions that the soul comes and goes in a variety of bodies, and it is through the knowledge sheath that the individual soul experiences grief and joy, pleasure and pain. And the three states of consciousness belong to this sheath. And these three states are the waking state, the dreaming state, and the dreamless state. The higher mind identifies itself with the duties, rituals, and attributes associated with the various stages of life. And the fifth sheath is called Anandamaya Kosha, or the sheath of bliss. It manifests mostly in dreamless sleep. Behind it is the innermost principle of all beings, Brahman, in its complete integrity. The sheath of bliss is not the supreme self, as it is based on conditions and is a modification of nature. We must go beyond the bliss consciousness in dreamless sleep to discover our true self, which is the source of unconditioned joy. In the Vivekachudamani, the disciple asks his guru a rather pertinent question. This is what he says. When the five sheaths have been rejected as unreal, I see nothing left over but the non-existence of all. What knowable reality remains with which the knower of the self can identify? the Guru replied, "Your question is excellent. You are good at reasoning. You must perceive by the most subtle thinking that the principle by which all your different states are experienced, but which is itself not an object of experience, is the self, the ultimate knower." In other words, we must understand that man has two different selves, one called the empirical self and the other the transcendental self. The former is mortal, ever-changing, and unreliable. Truth can only be realized by the transcendental self. We must not look at our reflection in a mirror and think that is who we really are, as it is only a reflection. Instead, we must learn to identify ourselves with the transcendental self, the divinity within, which cannot be seen by looking in a mirror. When we have become aware of our own true self as eternal and all-pervading, and when the empirical self is silenced, then we are free from evil and bondage. Then we are a divine ray, and like a lamp whose radiance shines out to others. The enlightened being who has realized the absolute does not return for reincarnation in this world. Here's another question. What is the nature of the absolute? So I'm going to read 4 verses, and one of them you have got on your screen there. Verses 239 to 242. Therefore, the Supreme Brahman is the one reality without a second. It is pure wisdom, the stainless one, absolute peace, without beginning and without end, void of action, and the essence of ceaseless bliss. When all the differences created by Maya have been rejected, there remains a self-illumined something which is eternal, fixed, without stain, immeasurable, without form, unmanifested, without name, indestructible. The wise know that the supreme truth is absolute consciousness, in which are united the knower, the known, and the knowledge, and is infinite and unchangeable. Brahman is the infinite, eternal, all-pervading light. It can be neither taken hold of nor abandoned. It is inconceivable by the mind and inexpressible by speech, immeasurable, without beginning, without end. How can we realize the absolute? And the answer is by meditating on the fact that we are fundamentally that which never dies, and that nothing but pure being exists. Verse 259 says, "You are that absolute which is indestructible, free from birth, growth, development, decay, disease, and death." Meditate on this in your mind. And verse 260 says, "You are that absolute which has no distinction, whose essential nature remains ever unchanged, which is motionless like a waveless ocean, which is ever free, which is incapable of undergoing division." Meditate on this in your mind. By meditating on these statements and others, doubts and difficulties will disappear, and you will see the teachings clearly. Separate the self from non-self and the realm of sense objects, and then remain true to that self. Identify yourself with that which dwells in the cave of the heart. The self lies hidden by impressions of the not self, and when these impressions have been destroyed, the true self manifests clearly, on its own accord. We are warned to be ever watchful and not careless or casual, to concentrate continuously on the absolute, the self, and by saying, "This I am." How can we concentrate on the self? We can do this by letting go of the body and sense objects. We must keep to the spiritual path and not become sidetracked by the pursuit and pleasure of power, which will ultimately lead to pain and suffering and other hardships. We must apply discipline and virtue to our daily life and let go of prejudice, vanity, anger, and avarice. For the seeker of the real, the aim is to be able to contemplate the divine with a pure heart, a heart from which all desires have been eliminated. As I've already said, this state is not reached only by the study of books, but by discrimination, detachment, devotion, and discernment. The result is ananda, or bliss, an imperishable, all-pervasive consciousness. It cannot be expressed by the mind apart from the use of symbols. And the highest expression, as I've already said, Sat Chit Ananda. The results of following the disciplines of meditation and devotion are the emergence of a higher faculty of knowledge, buddhi, and communion with the Absolute, the All Highest, and then to absorption of the individuality. The great realization of the absolute consciousness as the self takes place not in the mind through logic or reason, but by connecting with the ever-present, often hidden center of our being, that divine spark which shines from within. The seeker of truth has only to look within for eternal bliss and liberation from the unreality of the material world. Therefore, be strong in the conviction that the true self is there to be discovered, and let go of personality and the pleasures of this earth. The mark of someone who is liberated in this life and has realized the crest jewel of wisdom is that they have no sense of I or mine regarding the physical body. They do not remember the past with nostalgia or take any special thought to the future, and they receive whatever comes at the present moment with indifference. The mark of one liberated in life is that he sees the oneness in all, and he sees his self and the Absolute as one. What are the characteristics of a spiritual practitioner? I've got 6 here, which I shall read out to you. The first is that the personality radiates harmony, love, and peace. They have a serene demeanor. They have a great sense of justice and compassion. The pairs of opposites, such as success or failure, pain or pleasure, no longer hold their power. Theory and practice have become one, as to know wisdom is to live a life of wisdom. And the last one is their motives are selfless and pure and all-inclusive. It's a quote from another verse, in verse 568. When such a disciplined soul attains at death the nature of the Absolute as pure, undifferentiated being, total transcendence without even the appearance of a body, he does not return for reincarnation. Coming to the end, near the end, the results of these teachings. When the Guru had finished his teachings, the pupil declared that his mind had disappeared and self-interested activity had dropped away, as he now had direct knowledge of the Absolute. He went on to describe his experience thus. Speech cannot express and mind cannot encompass the glory of the ocean of the Absolute. My mind is like a hailstone melted in that ocean and filled with the nectar of unbroken bliss. What is there to reject and what to accept? Only one's self exists. The pupil realizes how much he has changed, and since assuming his true nature, reality and bliss. He declares, I am transcendent, the eternal good. I'm neither this nor that, but that supreme pure principle which illumines both. There is nothing outside me and nothing inside me. I am the infinite absolute, one without a second. I am neither a performer of action nor one who promotes action in others. I neither perceive nor promote perception in others. I am he, Soham, the self, luminous self without a parallel. I am the self of all. I am all. Yes, I am beyond all. Transcendent, undifferentiated consciousness. I am given bliss. So to sum up, we have discovered that Viveka means spiritual discrimination, and that Chudamani means crest jewel, which is the crest above the human forehead. We have discovered that the true reality is not what we can discern using the faculties of the senses and the logical mind. For as the crest jewel implies, the truth lies above and beyond the mind. If the absolute is beyond human comprehension, how are we expected to be able to recognize it in this material world, which is the only one we know? Paradoxically, it is by using logic and reasoning that we conclude we have to reach out beyond all known things and, in spite of appearances, accept that the world we inhabit cannot be true reality, as it will eventually perish, as does the human body. But there is something that never dies, never changes, the one that was, is, and ever will be. By using our inner strength, by perseverance, and by stilling the mind, and by gazing beyond appearances towards the infinite, we can achieve our goal. Reality encompasses and transcends all time and space, and within it there is no difference between one who knows and what is known. So reality is infinite, eternal, non-dual consciousness.